Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this inquiry. And here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Today's version of the Virtual Center for the Study of the United States Constitution. I am Bill O'Brien. It is such a pleasure to be with you. Today we are into the first Monday in August. Some of the temperatures we're having here in the mountains, it was around 50 degrees this morning, and it kind of suggests an early fall or something. But I don't anticipate that all the heat and the summer is gone by any stretch. It is a pleasure to be with you today, as it always is. I encourage you to actively become involved in our program, actively become involved in supporting the Head On Radio Network, which makes this program possible, and the kind of conversation that it seems to me our political fabric in today's world needs more than ever. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to email me directly, and I've gotten a few emails over the weekend that I kind of wanted to touch on today, mainly as a point of gratitude for the people that sent them. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, 906, all one word, no punctuation, at gmail.com. I wanted to go back to our last program and specifically pick up on where we left off. If you remember, we were looking at the preamble to the 1892 Populist Platform. The Populist Party ran on the national level a candidate for president in 1892 under a platform which I called extremely radical, and I continue to say that, and I want to make that point today. That's one of the things I want to do. One of the things that I think all of us need to be aware of, a crisis at the Virtual Center, sort of. We have a kitten that we've adopted, and this kitten has decided that he wants to get in the house by climbing up the windows on the screens on the outside. So there he was, hanging from the screen on the side of the house as I looked out the window. So anyway, I had to, I don't know whether I was more interested in rescuing the cat or rescuing my screen. But anyway, let's get back to where we were. The Populist Party platform of 1892 is, I believe, one of the most important documents in American history for a number of reasons. It is the culmination, with the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, it is the culmination of a radical strain within American society that dominates America in the 1870s and the 80s and into the early 90s. Many of you will remember, if you remember your history courses at all, the late 19th century period was one of the most violent in terms of labor history in the United States that we've ever seen. Some of the strikes, the very famous labor strikes, the Homestead strikes, the Pullman strike of 1892, the Homestead strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the railroad strikes of 1877. I can remember reading when I was in graduate school doing research. I can remember reading some labor newspapers that were published in Chicago during the Haymarket strike of 1886 and the railroad strike of 1887. And one of the articles, one of the magazines that I looked at, and I can remember this very well because it totally blew my mind, was the use of federal troops to crush the railroad strikes and the focus of attention in the area that we're in is in what is now the Panhandle of West Virginia, which is Martinsburg, and trainloads of federal troops were embarking from trains. There was a federal takeover, literally. And some of the headlines in the newspapers, in these labor newspapers, in fact, I can remember a headline in the New York Times which read that basically the city of Seattle was under the control of communists, is what this article said. This was one of the most violent, in terms of labor history in the United States, one of the most violent periods in our history. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, because this is usually a separate section of a chapter in a history textbook or a chapter on its own, depending on the level of the age of the students taking the course. One of the things that is going on by the time you get into the late 70s and 1880s is that the same kind of radicalism that is taking shape in urban America with industry is also happening within the agricultural movement. And, of course, the focus of attention in rural America primarily are the railroads. And the farmers, because they live in rural America, obviously, in order to get their products to market, farmers are totally dependent on the railroads. And what that means is that they are susceptible and vulnerable to fluctuating railroad rates. And there's a lot of concern that these conglomerate railroad companies that, the railroads are owned by these huge, very wealthy conglomerate, the Vanderbilts and the A.P. Hills and these kind of people. And the argument, the argument is that these people are among the farmers is that these people are manipulating prices for people that really don't have the choice. They don't have a free market. There's only one railroad. And so, in a sense, they are prisoners to a fluctuating railroad system, rate system. And there's all sorts of stories of kickbacks and all the rest of it. The other thing is that they are convinced, many of these farmers, that the railroads are in cahoots with the banks. And the railroads are basically advising the banks on what they need to do with loans and interest rates and everything else. And so the farmers believe that one of the strategies for putting them out of business is to basically see them go into such deep debt that they can't get out, and they're forced to surrender their properties. At minimum, they're forced to pay the rates that the railroads charge them to get their crops to market. And if it happens to be a bad year, if there's drought or if there's floods or whatever would happen to be that would make it a bad crop year, then they go into debt. And the fact of the matter is, some of these farmers are in such deep debt that they're in danger of losing their property, and they're desperate. So the point is, there's an element of radicalism within agriculture, within the farmer movement in America, which is simultaneous with what's going on in industry, in corporate America. And one of the most interesting things is to look at the growth of radicalism within agriculture. And of course, I grew up in Boston, so I knew nothing. I still don't know anything, really. But I knew nothing about agriculture at all, other than what I read in the papers, as the famous expression goes. But so a lot of this wasn't clear to me. But as I got into this, I began to trace. You can trace the growth of radicalism within the farmer movement. It begins in the early and mid 70s, 1870s, with what are called the emergence of cooperatives, where farmers begin to pool their resources and purchase together and sell together, with the idea that if they pool their crops and if they buy together, then they're going to be able to play the free market the way the market they believe is intended to be played. That in a sense, if they pool their crops with other farmers who are trying to sell their crops, get their crops to market, then together they would have more bargaining power with the railroads than they do separately. And the same thing is true with purchasing. They begin to open cooperatives in order to buy needed supplies and seed and various other things. So the cooperative movement becomes, very, very, very important in the 70s, in the early and mid 70s. And by the late 70s, these cooperatives become very politically active. And they begin to, and of course the Populist Party itself doesn't happen until the 1880s. But these cooperatives begin to run their own candidates for local legislatures and town councils and county boards and those kinds of things. And they begin to realize that if they really band together and organize, they can get their people into key positions during elections. And that would give them a voice at the table, so to speak. And so that movement begins to, transitions by the time you get into the 1880s, into the establishment of these cooperatives. And what you see is they tend to be regional. In other words, the movement goes from local to something much more regional. And these groups begin to form regional outfits, regional cooperatives, the Northern Cooperative, the Midwest Cooperative, the Western Cooperative. There's even a cooperative in the South, and there's also a colored cooperative for ex-slaves, for blacks who work in agriculture in the South. In other words, there are 5 or 6 regional cooperatives by the time you get to the mid-'80s that are becoming not only organized, but are becoming very active politically. And this becomes the fodder for what becomes the Populist Party in the late 1880s. And populists on the regional level begin to run their own candidates for office, and in a couple of situations, they're actually able to win majorities in certain state legislatures in very rural states. And consequently, they're beginning to get very favorable legislation to farmers, from many of these state legislatures. And one of the things they're after, and these are called Granger Laws, legislation. They're looking for legislation on the state level to regulate railroad rates and regulate the behavior of the railroads, because that's really for them, where the problem lies. That's, from their perspective, that's their problem. If they can get some control over the railroads. So many of these states begin to pass regulatory legislation to regulate the behavior of railroads. And some of these, the railroads, of course, go to court. They look to the courts to try to offset or counter some of these so-called Granger Laws that are being passed. And one of the most famous pieces of legislation, one of the most famous Supreme Court cases that is heard is in the late 70s. I believe it's in 1877. And it's called Munn versus Illinois. And it basically is a case that the railroads bring to the Supreme Court based on Granger Laws in the state of Illinois, which regulate railroad rates, in and out of Chicago. And the Supreme Court in Munn versus Illinois upholds the constitutionality of the Granger Laws. And for the first time, the Supreme Court talks about the public interest. And it's specifically talking about railroads. And the court says we are not at all challenging or taking issue with or whittling away at our faith in the idea of private property and the fact that man's property is sanctified. In other words, we subscribe to the sanctity of private property. And that includes corporate profit. However, when the corporation is in the business of directly serving the public, which is what railroads do, then by definition, it subjects itself to the common good, to the public interest. And if government in the form of legislatures has in the name of the public interest passed legislation to protect the general public, then railroads are subject to those political decisions in the public interest. So the Supreme Court upholds the Granger Laws in 1877. 9 years later, 1886, another case goes up before the Supreme Court based on the issue of railroad rates, and this is the famous case of Wabash Railroad. And in the Wabash case, the Supreme Court, which is comprised of different justices by this time, it's 9 years later, the Wabash case finds against the constitutionality of the Granger Laws. And the court makes a distinction between interstate commerce and intrastate commerce. Basically, the argument is that railroad rates for railroads that run totally within a particular state are within the legitimate control of the state legislature to regulate rates and manage rates and the rest of it. Not to set them, because the states don't own the railroads. The company sets the price. But in the public interest, government has the right to lobby on behalf of the citizens. But the Supreme Court says, when a railroad crosses a state line and the commerce becomes interstate rather than intrastate, then obviously one state no longer has the right to set rates. And so in the particular case of Wabash, we're talking about a railroad that was running across the plains of the Midwest, and it crossed several states. And the Supreme Court's decision in that is that violates the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, because the Commerce Clause of the Constitution gives Congress, not state legislatures, but Congress, control over interstate commerce. What that decision does more than anything is send the message to farmers that their best option is to go national. They begin to realize that their efforts to take control of state legislatures and try to fix their problems within states can only go so far. And the Supreme Court in the Wabash decision, I believe more than anything else, sends the message to farmers that if you're really going to do something meaningful to protect agriculture and agricultural interests in this country, you're going to have to do it on the national level. You're going to have to go national. At that point, these regional groups, these regional parties, coalesce and form the Populist Party. And they hold their first convention in St. Louis in 1892. And they select a candidate for president. And he's an agriculturalist, as I recall. His name is Weaver. And he becomes the candidate of the Populists in the 1892 election. And one of the things they do at their first convention in 1892 is write a platform. And it is that platform that we began to look at last Wednesday. And it's that platform which I want to address today. And what I'm suggesting, and let me kind of put this into context because I think this is important. Just as the message from the Wabash case was that you can't fix these problems on the local level, you almost have to move to the national level. So what you see in agriculture is that movements transition from regional movements to statewide movements to a national movement. And part of the reason is because that's where the decision making is, and corporate attorneys for railroads and corporations are driving the agenda into the national arena anyway. And so in a sense, it's really kind of interesting because what we see is that corporate America moves from the local level to the national level because they believe that it's much easier to control what happens in Congress, one body, than it is to diversify your efforts by trying to get your voice heard and to try to influence elections in a variety of counties and states throughout the Midwest, the Midwest of the United States. In other words, it's much easier to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, by lobbying Congress. So business is very, very comfortable with this movement of decision making from the local or the state level to the national level. And that's really what I think Wabash signifies, is that the Supreme Court is effectively saying the same thing. The same thing is going to happen later on with the so-called progressive movement in the United States. The progressive movement is a reform movement. It begins on the local level. It begins in cities, because there's no question that the most negative aspects of the Industrial Revolution happen first in cities. It's in cities where you have unemployment and an increase in crime, where you have insufficient and inadequate housing, where you have an unsafe workplace, where you have disease and filth, and all the things that are associated with the worst aspects of urbanism in America or anywhere else. So progressivism is a reform movement which begins in America's cities to clean up, to address and clean up the problems, the negative problems created by the Industrial Revolution. But that movement moves from the municipal level to the state level. And then by the time you get into the beginning of the 20th century, in the person of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Republican, Bull Moose, and Democrat, the progressive movement moves from the local level to the state level to the national level. So in a sense, all of this is moving up the ladder into the national level, where the federal government is becoming much more involved. And basically, the assumption is that the solution to problems must happen on the national level, because the laws are written in such a way that you can't get state government to do it. If you think about this, I don't want to change the topic. I'll go off on a tangent here, or become diverted. But those of you listening might already have made the connection here and say, this sounds like the European Union trying to unify the nations of Western Europe by establishing a common money system, the euro, and setting up common decision-making apparatus within Western Europe in order to try to coalesce and unify the European market. And the basic premise is that if these individual nations can cooperate and come together and work together and make decisions together and operate together, then they will have much more clout on an emerging global network, a global economy, than they will as individuals, as individual countries. So the example is pretty much the same. And so the question is whether these nations of Europe are willing to give up their local autonomy, even though it makes perfect sense that they'll have much more clout if they can work together rather than working separately. And so the same kinds of issues, the same kinds of challenges, the same kind of controversies emerge in efforts to try to create the European Union in the 20th and into the 21st century in Europe, as we're facing 100 years earlier in the transition from the 19th century into the 20th century. So the point is that with the Wabash case, agricultural America, the farmers begin to realize that they must go nationally. They create the Populist Party on the national level, the People's Party. They hold their first convention in St. Louis in 1892, and they write this platform. And the platform is introduced by a fairly lengthy, this we looked at on Wednesday, and if you don't mind, I'd like to repeat it because I think it's pretty powerful. It could have been written, today. Much of it could have been written today as well. So it kind of suggests that the problems that these folks see really haven't gone away. And I think that's an issue in itself. And the preamble says as follows: the conditions which surround us best justify our cooperation. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench, the sanctity of the bench. And the candidate, by the way, that the Populists nominated is James K. Weaver. I think I mentioned last time, recently his name was Weaver. But anyway, the first convention, I think I said St. Louis. The party is formed in St. Louis, but the first convention meets in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1892. To continue with the preamble, the people are demoralized. Most of the states have been compelled to isolate the voters at the polling places to prevent universal intimidation and bribery. The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled. Public opinion silenced. Business prostrated. Homes covered with mortgages. Labor impoverished. And the land concentrating in the hands of capitalists, speculators. The urban workmen are denied the right to organize for self-protection. Imported pauperized labor beats down their wages. A hireling standing army, unrecognized by our laws, is established to shoot them down, and they are rapidly degenerating into European conditions. And of course, this shooting them down speaks to the use of what is usually referred to as the Pinkertons, hired goons that companies, railroads, and coal companies and steel companies hire to protect the property from the strikers. And of course, what happens is these private armies, if you will, are not averse to shooting strikers. That's what happens in Haymarket and Homestead and various other places. So that's what all of this refers to, the degeneration of circumstances into European conditions. The fruits, this is a very famous quote from this platform. This is the one that most textbooks usually pick up on. The fruits of the toil of millions are badly stolen to build up the colossal fortunes for a few. That's a pretty powerful line. The fruits of the toil of millions are badly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for the few. Unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessors of these, in turn, despise the republic and endanger liberty. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. The national power to create money is appropriated to enrich bondholders. A vast public debt payable in legal tender currency has been funded into gold-bearing bonds, thereby adding millions to the burdens of the people. And if I can stop and make a point here, I guess this is the years of teaching that comes out. I can't resist an opportunity to make a point. But one of the things that I wanted to say, which I'm sure many people realize this and understand this, but the point I would make is, if you look back in history, there's historical validation for this. One of the things we learn as we look at history, and look specifically at one of the most complicated issues in history, which is finance, which is money, the economy, very complicated, very hard to understand. There's one principle that drives this from the very beginning, and I think it's important that we all understand it. And that is that the more money there is in circulation, the better it is for debtors, for the poor. The other side of that coin is the less money there is in circulation, the better it is for creditors and banks and finance companies. It's common sense, but a lot of people don't realize it. If I borrow $1,000 from you, if I basically am able to get you to lend me $1,000, and I agree to pay you 10% interest on that $1,000, and to pay it off within a certain amount of time, 5 years or 10 years, whatever it would happen to be. So what that means is my monthly payments include principal plus interest, because I've agreed to an interest rate of 10% per year until the debt is finally paid off. So if it's $1,000 and it's a 10-year loan, then that breaks down. I have to do this because this is, math is one of my strongest suits. You can figure that out. If it's a 10-year loan for $1,000, then that means, on average, what that means is you're repaying $100 a year. But you're also paying you're also paying interest along with that. So your $100 actually becomes $110. And so the $10 is the interest that the creditor who loaned you the money gets. It's just basic finance. Everybody does that. If you bought a car or a television set or a refrigerator or a washing machine or anything else, you know what it is. There's principal and then there's interest. Basically, now into the equation enters the word that many of us are familiar with called inflation. And what inflation does is cheapen the value of the dollar. So what that means is, let's go back to our 10-year loan for a second. If inflation is pretty powerful, is pretty realistic, then the fact of the matter is the $1,000 that I borrow from you now is not going to be worth $1,000 in 10 years. It's going to be worth less because of inflation. So by definition, the interest rate not only is a fee for the loaning of the money, but it also covers the damage to the value of the dollar that inflation brings. So the point is that the more money I can borrow and the longer I can stretch out the payments, the less value I'm repaying you. The money that you get from me at the end is not equal to the amount of money you loaned me at the beginning because of inflation. So what that means is the value of my repayment is a little bit less than the value of what you loaned me because of inflation. And so what that means is that the more inflation there is, the less value there is to the dollar. And the less value there is to the dollar, the better off it is for the debtor, and the worse it is for the creditor. So throughout history, inflation has always been the friend of the debtor, never the friend of the loan of the creditor. It's important to know that. And the reason it's important to know that is because we are bombarded with advertising and messaging from lenders which suggest that inflation is the enemy of the working person. Banks and insurance companies have gone, and finance companies and loan companies and mortgage companies and all the rest of it have spent a lot of money in advertising in order to convince people that inflation hurts working people more than it hurts finance, banks. Historically, that's not been true. By definition, moneyed interests always seek to control inflation. Debtor interests always seek to increase inflation. And more than anything else, what increases inflation most is the amount of money in circulation. The more money there, the more dollars there are working in the economy, the less value per dollar they carry. It just stands to reason. That's why during the Revolution, for example, when farmers were in danger of losing their farms and they couldn't pay their taxes and they couldn't pay private loans and everything else, they lobbied state legislatures, They lobbied state legislatures in the Articles of Confederation to pass legislation that either postponed the debts or printed paper money. 7 of the 13 states printed paper money. And the reason they wanted more money printed is because the more money there was in circulation, the less value it had, and the more plentiful it was, the easier it was to get their hands on and pay off their debts. But in the process, what they're paying is not equivalent to what they borrowed. And that's the point to keep in mind. So what I'm saying is we are on the receiving end of a very, very concerted long-term campaign to convince us that even if we are debtors, we are better off when inflation is low. And I'm trying to suggest that that contradicts history of the past. The history, if you read history, it contradicts that. It counters that. And so that's why the populists put so much emphasis on money, and why they're talking here about the creation of 2 great classes, tramps and millionaires. And their last sentence in this particular paragraph, the national power to create money is appropriated to enrich bondholders. Now what that means is the way you enrich bondholders is to take money out of circulation, to limit the amount of money. So by putting currency, legal tender currency, on the gold standard and not considering silver as legal tender, by taking silver out of the equation and going exclusively on the gold standard, what government is doing is controlling inflation. It's increasing the value of money. It's doing what lenders want at the expense of what debtors want. And that's what the farmers are complaining about, is the amount of money in circulation. And therefore, they say, the very last phrase here, thereby adding millions to the burdens of the people. That's what they're talking about, is the amount of money in circulation. The more there is, the better it is for debtors. The less there is, the better it is for creditors. And it's always been that way. They go through and they elaborate on this a little bit, and they say, silver, which has been accepted as coin since the dawn of history, has been demonetized to add to the purchasing power of gold by decreasing the value of all forms of property as well as human labor. And the supply of currency is purposely abridged to fatten usurers, bankrupt enterprise, and enslave industry. That sentence kind of validates or clarifies the point that I was just making. By taking silver off the table, you make sure that there isn't as much money in circulation. It increases the value of gold. It hurts human labor. It hurts property values. It hurts everything. It increases property value. It increases the value of your property because it makes the money much more, the word they use is dear. The value of money is more dear. A vast conspiracy of mankind against mankind has been organized on 2 continents And it is rapidly taking possession of the world, these people say. So they see this not just as an American problem, but a problem that exists in the old country, in Europe as well. If not met and overthrown at once, it forebodes terrible social convulsions, the destruction of civilization, or the establishment of an absolute despotism. So basically what this preamble does is laying out an agenda. And the way they define that agenda is by saying that what we're experiencing is the division of society into two groups, tramps and millionaires. And that's exactly what we've got in this country today with the inequality of wealth and income that we are seeing, that all the numbers are telling us. And so, in a sense, there's the same kind of pressures that were on government then ought to be on government now. And the reason I say this is because our government went home this weekend for a long recess, for a 5-week recess, without passing a budget or anything else. So the way our government is dealing with this is not to deal with it. But that's an issue for another day. Let me go on with the preamble. We have witnessed, this document says, we have witnessed for more than a quarter century the struggles of the two great political parties for power and plunder, while grievous wrongs have been inflicted upon the suffering people. Of course, the message here is that the answer is not in one party over the other. Both parties are equally responsible for this. We charge that the controlling influences dominating both of these parties have permitted the existing dreadful conditions to develop without serious effort to prevent or restrain them. Neither do they now promise us any substantial reform. They have agreed together to ignore reflection moment there for a second. They have agreed to they have agreed together to ignore in the coming campaign every issue but one. They propose to drown the outcries of plundered people with the uproar of a sham battle over the tariff, so that capitalists, corporations, national banks, rings, trusts, watered stock, the demonetization of silver, and the oppressions of the usurers may all be lost sight of. They propose to sacrifice our homes, lives, and children on the altar of Mammon, to destroy the multitude in order to secure corruption funds from the millionaires. Basically, what the populists are saying in this platform, in this preamble, is that the two major parties are complicit in what's happening to average people, and that government is in cahoots with the two parties, and they are not doing, neither party is doing anything to address the real problems in the country. What they're trying to do is divert people's attention away from the problems with what they call this sham battle between the parties over the tariff. Now, inherent here is a lack of understanding of the importance of the tariff. It's very, very important in the Industrial Revolution, because whether you have a low tariff or a high tariff is really going to determine how much business you have. If you have a high tariff, if you're taxing goods coming into the country, if it's costing producers overseas a lot in taxes in order to sell their products in the United States, then it stands to reason that those same countries are going to retaliate against Americans. If we're charging high tariffs to keep out their products, they're going to charge high tariffs to keep out our products. And the result is that if high tariffs on both sides are inhibiting commerce and trade, that has a detrimental effect on the whole economy. It causes layoffs and strikes and everything else. So, I think the farmers in this platform are choosing not to see that. So it may be a little bit of an overstretch to say that this is a sham battle over the tariff. But there's no question, it's just one issue amongst others. More important than that, it is an issue which addresses the behavior of business, not working people. By going at the tariff, government is basically listening to business and the priorities of business, not the needs and the priorities of the general population, and that's very significant, and I think that's what the populists are responding to. Assembled on the anniversary of the birthday of the nation, and filled with the spirit of the Grand General-in-Chief who established our independence, we seek to restore the government of the Republic to the hands of the plain people, with which class it originated. We assert our purposes to be identical with the purposes of the National Constitution, to form a more perfect union and establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. What these people have decided to do is form a third party in order to give the people a choice. Basically saying, we're not asking people to pick one major party, the Democrats, over the other, the Republican, or vice versa. What we're saying is that neither one of those parties is really willing to address our problems. Therefore, we'll address them ourselves. Vote for us. Don't vote for either one of those parties. Basically, what we're talking about here is a party that is organized around the principle that Madison defined as the majority faction. If all working people, farmers and urban laborers, blacks, whites, women, men, immigrants, natural-born citizens, highly educated, less educated. In other words, if all people who work make that the operative organizing principle, doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what color you are, what church you go to, what sex you are, anything. All that matters is if you work, you've got a vested interest in joining us. If they were able to pull that off, literally, they would do what James Madison said in Federalist Number 10. We had to make sure it never happened. The majority faction, on the principle of majority rule, would take over the government apparatus of this country. The people would control it. It would be the equivalent of the Confederation period on the national level. The people would have the same power over government on the national level that the people had in the state level under the Articles of Confederation, which is what produced the Constitution of the United States in the first place. To be very blunt, as we're at 48 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 10 to 12 minutes left in this first segment. To be very blunt about it, this is the most dangerous political movement that the United States of America has seen since the Confederation, since independence itself. The anti-federalists tried to many of them, not all of them, many of them believed that anti-federalism was an effort to accomplish this against the moneyed interests that were supporting the Federalists. But they were not successful. As you know, ratification, state after state, the Federalists were able to win the day. But this was the battle. This was what it was about. This is what Madison had in mind when he talked about the dangers of the majority faction. And it's happening in the United States in the 1890s, and we don't have a mechanism to address it as a country. There's one more paragraph to the preamble before the document goes into the platform itself. Our country, the preamble says, finds itself confronted by conditions for which there is not precedent in the history of the world. Our annual agricultural production amount to billions of dollars in value, which must, within a few weeks or months, be exchanged for billions of dollars worth of commodities consumed in their production. The existing currency supply is wholly inadequate to make this exchange. The results are falling prices, the formation of combines and rings, the impoverishment of the producing class, the working people. We pledge ourselves that if given power, we will labor to correct these evils by wise and reasonable legislation. In accordance with the terms of our platform, we believe that the power of government, in other words, of the people, should be expanded, as in the case of the Postal Service, as rapidly and as far as the good sense of an intelligent people and the teaching of experience shall justify, to the end that oppression, injustice, and poverty shall eventually cease in this land. What a mission. Can you imagine the threat to the power structure in this country if this movement had been allowed to be successful? What is the platform? What exactly are they going to do? What do they stand for? We declare, therefore, this document says, first, that the union of the labor forces of the United States this day consummated shall be permanent and perpetual. May its spirit enter into all hearts for the salvation of the Republic and the uplifting of mankind. The union of the labor forces of the United States is consummated this day. All working people have a vested interest in making this successful. That's the first item in their platform. It's the most radical item. If the majority faction organizes, power ceases to be in the hands of the few. That's what Madison's point was. The first item in this platform, on this agenda, is to bring about the majority faction by organizing all working people. Second, wealth belongs to him who creates it. And every dollar taken from industry without an equivalent is robbery. The people who produce are the people that should get the reward for that production. Not the brokers, not managers, not stockholders, not corporate boards, not rich millionaires and billionaires and all the rest of it. If this is a quote, if any will not work, neither shall he eat, unquote. The interests of rural and civil labor are the same. Their enemies are identical. This is a war. This document is a statement of political war between working people and those people that are reaping most of the profit. It is the classic definition of radicalism. Third, we believe that the time has come when the railroad corporations, now this is the farmers talking, we believe that the time has come when the railroad corporations will either own the people or the people must own the railroads. And should the government enter upon the work of owning and managing all the railroads, we should favor an amendment to the Constitution by which all persons engaged in government service shall be placed under a civil service regulation of the most rigid character, so as to prevent the increase of the power of the national administration by the use of such additional government employees. What we are talking about here is a government takeover, ownership of all the railroads. Now, this is socialism, because this is the end of free enterprise. This is the replacement of free enterprise with government ownership. They want the government to take over the railroads, but they don't trust government either. So what they want is a rigorous civil service system for government employees in order to make sure that government doesn't become an independent power holder, but rather government remains true to its mission, which is to serve the people. The people control government, and that's what they're after here. And the next item in their platform is finance. We demand a national currency, safe, sound, and flexible, issued by the general government only. A full legal tender for all debts, public and private, and that without the use of banking corporations. Notice, government controls the money supply. Only government issues money. It's tender for all debts, public and private. This without the use of banking corporations, banks who tend to make their own loans and generate their own currency. A just, equitable, and efficient means of distribution direct to the people at a tax not to exceed 2% per annum, to be provided as set forth in the sub-treasury plan of the Farmers Alliance, and a better system also by payments in discharge of its obligations for public improvements. Basically, they want government, which is going to be under the control of the people because of the civil service system. They want government to take over control of money. They want government to control lending, not the banks. They want to make sure that the system of distribution of money is fair and equitable and efficient. They are advocating a tax of 2% per year as set forth in the sub-treasury plan of the Farmers Alliance. What the Farmers Alliance talked about was that since farmers sell on a world market, they sell agricultural products in a world market, it sometimes happens that when it comes time to market your crop, the prices happen to be very, very low. Maybe there's a glut on the market. Maybe there's an oversupply to the point that the value of your wheat or your corn or your cotton or whatever it is you're selling is less. They want the government to undertake what they call a sub-treasury plan. They want government to buy your crop at a reasonable rate if the market is so low that it's not worth the farmer's while to sell it on the open market. In other words, they want government to provide through the sub-treasury system a backup for a weak seller's market. So that if you've got a crop of corn that's going to rot in the field unless you market it, but the price for corn is very low, then they want you to be able to sell it to government. Government will hold it until the price goes up, and then government will sell it. And you, that way, as the farmer, you get a fair price for your product. It eliminates the risk of the ups and downs of the agricultural market throughout the world. They demand free and unlimited coinage of silver and gold at the legal ratio of 16 to 1. You know, 1 ounce of silver, 1 ounce of gold is equivalent to 16 ounces of silver. We demand that the amount of circulating medium, currency, speedily be increased to not exceed, to not less than $50 per capita. They want more money in circulation. They want a graduated income tax. They want people's taxes to be based on what they make. The people who make the most pay the most. And we know that that's our system now, except that there are so many loopholes that have been created in the system that the people who should be paying the most are actually paying the least. We believe that the money of the country should be kept as much as possible in the hands of the people. Hence, we demand that all state and national revenues be limited to the necessary expenses of government, economically and honestly administered. They want postal savings banks. In transportation, they want government ownership of telegraphs and telephones. They want communication and transportation to be fair and equitable. And there's a whole lot more. We've reached the top of the hour here. There's a whole lot more. And at the end of the document, itself, they add what they call an expression of sentiments. These are the kinds of things we believe in. They say, while this is not part of the platform of the People's Party, these resolutions are expressive of the sentiment of this convention. These are the things we believe. And then they issue us a series of what they call resolutions. Resolve, this is resolved, we resolve this, we resolve that, etc. This is one of the most radical documents, I think, in all of American history. It needs to be read that way. If you don't understand the context, if you don't have any understanding or sense of history, then you miss much of the meaning of these documents. It's there, but it's very difficult to bring out of the language unless you understand the context within which this document is created. Now what we need to address in our second hour today is the response to this document. What do those who traditionally have held power in this country see as their options in the face of this? What must they do, and how will they do it? I closed Wednesday's program, and I'm going to close this hour with the same comment. The progressive movement, in large part, is the middle-class response to this radicalism. Many of us associate the word progressivism with radicalism. I would suggest to you that the progressive movement in this country, the emergence of progressivism in the late 19th and early 20th century, is a middle-class movement driven by middle-class values in the face of a document like this. These people, middle-class values, do not condone what the Populist Party platform of 1892 is about. They do not, it does not condone, middle-class value system does not condone the takeover, the control of government by the majority of the people. We talked about that. We were talking about Madison and Federalist number 10. But it's absolutely important that the issues addressed in this platform must be addressed by somebody. I would suggest to you that somebody is the progressive movement. It is not a movement designed to carry out the will of the populist platform of 1892. It is a middle-class movement intended to subvert it. With that, let's take our break. We're at 3 minutes after the hour. We'll take 5 minutes, and we'll come back and finish our second hour. And I really think that this particular hour might be one you want to hang on for, because I think this is really important stuff. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to today's Virtual Center for the Study of the United States Constitution. I am Bill O'Brien, and if you are just joining us for this, our second hour, we welcome you. If you were here during our first hour, we thank you for staying with us. Our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. That's area code area code 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to email me directly, waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. If you're just joining us, we were kind of going back over, but a little bit more, I think a little bit more detail, in what we had closed Wednesday's program out with the platform of the Populist Party in 1892, and we went through some of the ingredients of that platform. We spent most of our time looking at the preamble, and in the platform itself, it addressed the issues which really was at the heart of the formation of the Populist Party in 1892. And this is the platform of the convention, the first convention of the Populists held in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892. The party was created in St. Louis. And I think it's very relevant. I believe, I said this numerous times in the past, I believe that there's meaning to the fact that in Jefferson's preamble to the Declaration of Independence, he put liberty before he mentioned inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Equality. When Jefferson says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The point that I'm making is, I think that the fact that he mentions equality before he mentions people's natural rights to life, liberty, and property has meaning. I think it's significant. I don't think it's just grammatical. I don't think it's just made to make the document sound better. I think there's significance there. And I would suggest to you that the mention of equality is really what the challenge of the American Republic is all about, it seems to me. Likewise, I don't think it's an accident that the first principle, the first substantive point, once the preamble is completed in this document, the first point that the document makes is that the union of labor forces of the United States, this day consummated, shall be permanent and perpetual. I think it is very significant not only that the Populist Party platform made the point that this was not a farmers' party, this was a party welcoming all people who worked. It was a conscious effort to unite working people, rural and urban. The fact that that's the first point in the platform, I would suggest to you, is not an accident. It seems to me the most radical potential of this document is in that first item. Then they talk in the second one about the idea that the people who produce the wealth should own it. Wealth belongs to the person who creates it, not the person who steals it. And then they talk about railroads, and they want public ownership, government ownership of railroads, government ownership of transportation, government control of the currency, government control of the availability of credit, government ownership of transportation, government control of the value of money through its monetary policies, and a number of and the sub-treasury system, where if the market that farmers must sell into is down, then they feel that government's responsibility is move in and buy their crops and hold them until the price goes up. That's a risk that government should bear, not the farmer. Now, if you think that's unreasonable, and this is a diversion, this is an aside, but it's something that just occurred to me. If you think that that sounds unreasonable, then I would suggest to you, just look at what you're paying for a gallon of gasoline. Look at how the price per gallon of the gasoline you buy responds to what's happening throughout the world. If there's a terrorist threat from the Middle East, the price of your gasoline goes up. You are being asked to pay a fee, whether in fact you use the product or not. I can remember a few years ago, for example, I used natural gas. I can remember a few years ago when, before they started the payment plan where you pay an equal amount each month. It was a struggle sometimes in the height of the cold winter to pay your gas bill. But what everybody looked forward to was the idea that during the months of May, June, July, August, and September, you paid almost nothing. And people looked forward to the fact that they would, that they would have 4 or 5 months in the year when they didn't have to pay for a gas bill. Well, what happened was they created this system where you can prorate your bill over the year. You pay so much a month, and the reason for that is the rates will be going so high. The same thing is true with your electric bill and everything else. In other words, once the rates get so high, the only way they can the only way that they can avoid dealing with whether in fact the rates are too high is to spread the payments out over the whole year. So now the fact of the matter is I'm on the payment plan. What that means is I pay a gas bill in the middle of summer even though I'm not using any. And that gives the gas company the opportunity to build up a backlog of my money, to accumulate a lot of my money for the coming season when there'll be a lot of gas. Now, then it's not only my money. They have this payment plan where presumably most subscribers, which means that they have an awful lot of money because they are building up a backlog of money from my account and everybody else's account. And if it happens to be a warm winter or whatever, I guess the question is, are they entitled to invest this money and to keep the profit? Because they're dealing in tens of millions of dollars. I'm not. But when they pool my money with everybody else's in a season when nobody's using any gas, natural gas, then what we're basically doing is giving the utility companies an awful lot of capital to play with. And what kind of control is there over that? The point I'm trying to make is when you look at how the consumer today bears the risk of international incidents around the world, the oil companies who set the price of gasoline, they don't bear the risk. I was one of these people when I was in school. I was taught to believe that, that there were certain things that were part of the risk of doing business. But what has happened is that in many cases, businesses have been able to shift the risk to the consumer. And all you have to do is look at the utilities companies to see that when they go to the state and ask for rate increases to cover the expenses of or the threats of or natural disasters or wars or terrorist threats or whatever. I mean, all of these things, basically the consumer is paying the risk of all these and government's letting them do it. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you think that it's unreasonable, the sub-treasury system is unreasonable from the populist point of view, where government moves in and buys their crops and holds the crops until the market improves. If you think that's a little bit of a stretch and the farmers may be asking for more than they have a right to, think of what business is asking for in today's world in terms of setting gasoline prices and oil prices and electric rates and all the rest of it. And I think you'll get the idea that the consumer is bearing the risk, not corporations. And part of that is the relationship that exists between businesses and government from the very beginning. Sometimes it becomes a little bit hard to justify. I had mentioned at the end of the platform, I'm almost reluctant to drop this topic without completing it. I mentioned that there were a number of resolutions at the very end of the platform in 1892, and as the populists say, these things are not part of the platform, but these resolutions are expressive of the sentiment of this convention. I'm going to just touch on several of them very quickly so you just get a sense as to what they're saying. And what they're saying, this isn't what we're running for president on, or this is not what our campaign's about in 1892, but these are the things we believe. First, resolved, that we demand a free ballot. These are the kinds of things they're promising to do if they get in. We demand a free ballot and a fair count in all elections and pledge ourselves to secure it to every legal voter without federal intervention through the adoption by the states of the unperverted Australian or secret ballot system. Now, we have the secret ballot today. They didn't. So what they're after, what they're committed to, is the idea that if elections are so important in our society, then people ought to have the right to vote privately with the secret ballot. So that's one of the principles that they support. Second, resolved, that the revenue derived from a graduated income tax should be applied to the reduction of the burden of taxation now levied upon the domestic industries of this country. That government take the graduated income tax, graduated meaning the people who make the most pay the most, they should use that money to reduce the burden of taxation upon the domestic industries. In other words, they ought to do whatever they need to do in order to reduce the taxes that businesses have to pay so that they can employ more people. Third, we pledge our support to fair and liberal pensions to Union soldiers and sailors. This is obviously throwback to the Civil War. In a sense, doing for us, our veterans, doing what we ought to do to our veterans, and this is still an issue today. Fourth, we condemn the fallacy of protecting American labor under the present system, which opens our ports to the pauper and criminal classes of the world and crowds out our wage earners, and we denounce the present ineffective laws against contract labor and demand the further restriction of undesirable immigration. So basically what they're talking about is the importation of immigrant labor as a way to win concessions from working people. And we remember last week we talked about the Lowell girls, the Waltham system, and when the girls began to strike, what the mills began to do is import immigrant labor, cheap labor. And the idea is if there are people standing there to take your job, then you lose your bargaining power as a working person. So what these people want to do is keep out the cheap foreign labor in order to make sure that our domestic labor gets the jobs. And of course that gives the working people clout because there's not an oversupply of labor. We cordially sympathize with the efforts of organized working men to shorten the hours of labor and demand a rigid enforcement of the existing 8-hour law on government work and ask that a penalty clause be added to the said law. Notice how much of what's in here is a direct appeal to urban labor. These are farmers. This is a concerted effort to unite the groups by making conscious concessions to the interests and the priorities of urban labor. We regard the maintenance of a large standing army of mercenaries known as the Pinkerton system as a menace to our liberties, and we demand its abolition. And of course the Pinkertons, if you read this period, they go all the way back to the Hessians prior to the American Revolution, where the British government employed foreign mercenaries. If you remember, I would suggest, without going into off on another direction, I would suggest to you that these private companies who are hiring contractors to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan now, very, very significant, because these people, in effect, are armed people, and what they do affects our foreign policy. So in a sense, they are a private army employed by government, but not under the control of the community. I would suggest to you constitutionally this is very, very dangerous. 7, resolve that we commend to the federal favorable consideration of the people and reform press the legislative system known as the initiative and the referendum. What they want are political reforms to give voters the opportunity to initiate new legislation. If their elected representatives won't pass it, then the people have the power to pass it themselves, right over the heads of their elected representatives. And you can see the potential radical nature of this. We favor a constitutional provision limiting the office of president and vice president to 1 term and providing for the election of senators of the United States by a direct vote of the people, and we know we get that. So they see giving the people control over the Senate, giving people more control over the White House by forcing presidents to only serve 1 term. And of course, the idea is that the people would have more say in government. We oppose any subsidy or national aid to any private corporation for any purpose. And then finally, the last resolution, that this convention sympathizes with the Knights of Labor and their righteous contest with the tyrannical combine of clothing manufacturers of Rochester, and declare it to be a duty of all who hate tyranny and oppression to refuse to purchase the goods made by the said manufacturers or to patronize any merchants who sell such goods. These people want to adopt the same tactics that the American colonies adopted in 1775 and 1776. Non-consumption. If companies are not treating their workers the way the workers ought to be treated, then we will boycott what they make. And we will force them to operate according to rules that are humane. Notice where the power of each one of these initiatives is. It's not in government. It's in the hands of the people. And I think this is very significant. And as I mentioned, the populist movement begins, the progressive movement is an urban, the populist movement is addressing the problems of farmers. At the same time as the worst aspects of the Industrial Revolution are happening in New England and in the Midwest and in the industrial system and the growth of urban America, and the flow of people leaving the farms, because with technology, with the Industrial Revolution, comes the employment of more and more technology in agriculture, which means fewer and fewer employees are necessary. So population is moving into the cities. It's not only coming from overseas, but it's coming from the farms into the cities. And the cities are exploding. And they are wholly inadequate to deal with this kind of population growth, this kind of population explosion, if you will, in the cities. And what we see are problems associated with what we call the urban, what we usually refer to as the urban problem. Inadequate housing, unsafe housing, disease, security, crime, poverty, all of it. Transportation problems, sanitation problems, on and on and on and on. And then we find, and of course, without getting into all the details of this movement, there are some of there were a whole group of journalists who become very prominent during this period. Most textbooks refer to them as the muckrakers. You know, the idea that these are the people that dig in the muck and come up with the dirt. And these muckrakers begin to point out some of the worst aspects of industrialism, the worst uncontrolled, unmanaged, unregulated aspects of the Industrial Revolution in America. And one of the most famous is Lincoln Steffens and his famous series, The Shame of the Cities, which is published in a book. It's a series of articles in a journal, but later on it's published into a book, and it's called The Shame of the Cities. And in that book, Lincoln Steffens is talking about the stockyards, about the industry associated with the slaughter of animals in the meatpacking industry in the Midwest, in and around Chicago. And he's talking about the unsanitary conditions and the inhumane working conditions that exist in these. And he has stories about people who cut off fingers, and the fingers go right into the grinder along with meat and all the rest. It's just some of the most horrendous stories, and it just shocks the American people. Basically, what we need to understand here is the progressive movement totally reshapes public opinion, and the temper of the country moves with progressivism into what we call a liberal frame of mind. What the progressive journalists and muckrakers and the rest of them are able to do is point out the problems and then suggest solutions to them. And what they are doing increasingly is educating the general public on the evils and the solutions. And the one common solution to almost every one of these problems is government. More power for government on the municipal level. More power in the hands of mayors. More power in the hands of city councils. More power in the hands of commissions, of city commissions that manage cities. More power in state legislatures, more power in the hands to government, and then eventually more power to Congress, more power to the federal government. In other words, the idea is if we're going to solve all of these problems, then the only entity that seems big enough and capable enough to address them is government. So increasingly what the progressive movement does is sell the idea to the general public that what is called for in this country is a more activist, a more aggressive, a more interventionist government. Government must be more involved in managing and regulating what happens in the private sector. Government must manage transportation rates. Government must oversee the setting of prices. Government must oversee price fixing between corporations. Government must move in and guarantee people safe and secure and healthy working conditions. Government must come in and abolish things like child labor and imported immigrant labor and abusive labor and all the rest of it. And so increasingly, this is a middle class movement, primarily because the middle class sees government as the solution to many of these problems. And so increasingly, there is sentiment for an activist government more and more and more. This is the solution to the problems. I would suggest to you it is also a way to circumvent or undercut the most radical potential of the populist movement. From the perspective of the average citizen, if government's going to fix these things, then we don't need a third party. That's common sense. That just makes sense. Why I voted Democratic or I voted Republican all my life. Why should I change? Well, the populists tell me the reason I should change is because they're all in cahoots and they're not really dealing with the real problems that I face on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, I'm going to support a third party that will. But wait a minute. If government is going to begin to move in and address these problems, if there is a political party that's more aggressive and more activist and more interventionist and all the rest of it, then why go for a third party? Why not just support much more activity, much more civic awareness and civic commitment within the current parties? Why not support the Democrats? And so, in a sense, from that perspective, progressivism pretty much takes the major part of the steam out of the progressive movement, especially in the election of the progressives do very well in 1892. They don't come close to winning. Third parties never win. But it sets the stage for the election of 1896, which many textbooks believe is one of the most prominent and important elections in American history. And in that election, the populists nominate for their candidate William Jennings Bryan. And those of you out there who a light just went off and said, wait a minute, William Jennings Bryan, isn't he the Scopes trial guy? Isn't he the one that was defending creationism and fundamentalism in the Bible and all the rest of it? And I'm saying, yeah, that's exactly right. The populists nominate William Jennings Bryan as their candidate in 1896. And lo and behold, so do the Democrats. The Democrats hold their convention, and they nominate the same candidate that the populists nominated. Now the question, I'm just asking questions here. This is not my area of strength, but I just have to ask you, if you're William Jennings Bryan, what would be your rationale for accepting the nomination of two major parties? In effect, aren't you basically saying that me winning is more important than the party winning? In effect, hasn't the candidate pretty much done damage to the substance of the movement by accepting the nomination of the Democrats? Effectively, haven't the Democrats, by nominating the same candidate for president in 1896, haven't the Democrats effectively sent the message to voters that it's not necessary to vote for third party because we got the same guy? You can get the same thing and not change? So the sum total of the 1896 election is the demise of populism. And I think an awful lot of research is called. There's a lot of information. There have been several books on the election of 1896. But I think the study that really is going to get into the innards of this campaign in order to find out to what extent the destruction of populism was really the driving issue in the election. By moving in and promising many of the same reforms that the populists stood for, you basically made the Populist Party redundant. That is an outcome, but I would suggest to you it obviously doesn't escape the planners from the very beginning. If I'm a Democratic organizer and planner, I'm threatened to hell and back by the Populist Party, and anything that I can do to cut their knees, cut their legs, cut them off at the knees, so to speak. I'm losing the term. I'm going to do. So basically, they do it by nominating William Jennings Bryan. And while the populists do very well, well, William Jennings Bryan does very well in 1896. It's not nearly enough, and the Republicans are able to nominate William McKinley. But one of the most interesting facets of this whole campaign, it seems to me, is to look at the money and the interests of corporate America in this campaign and how committed they are to destroying the potential of the Populist Party. And I think that's a significant factor. I think that's very, very relevant. So what we end up with is populism, and it begins on the municipal level, and then it moves to the state level, and then it logically moves to the national level, and it makes perfect sense, because increasingly the assumption is that the problems are bigger than local government or regional government can handle. And so increasingly the federal government begins to think in regulatory and interventionist terms, and we have the emergence of what we call progressivism as a political philosophy, and the idea that government's job is to manage and to regulate in the interest of the public. Government's job, according to the preamble of the Constitution, is to do all the things that the populists listed in their platform. To promote the general welfare, provide, maintain domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. If government's going to do that, it needs to become much more active and much more aggressive. And I think the most telling thing, and again, everybody knows this, so this is more a matter of perspective and emphasis than it is on information. But the election campaign that really seems to be the high point of progressivism is the election of 1912. And in 1912, we have three candidates and three parties. We have the Democrats, who nominate Woodrow Wilson as their candidate. We have the mainstream Republican Party that nominates William Howard Taft as their candidate. And then we have the so-called Progressive or Bull Moose Party, led by Theodore Roosevelt, that walks out of the Republican convention, and Roosevelt becomes the head of a third party movement. Notice as quickly as 1912 that there's really effectively no progressive candidate here at all. I think that's very significant. But when Theodore Roosevelt bolts the Republican convention and runs as a third-party candidate, as the so-called Bull Moose candidate, I think that's very significant. But what's more significant, and I think it's worth noting, is that when the election results are in, William Howard Taft finishes a very distant third. The real contest is between Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, both of whom identify themselves as progressives. What that means is that the nation as a whole, the mentality of the nation, has shifted as a result of the progressive movement and the populist movement to the point that people are looking to government to do things that heretofore they never believed government should have any business doing. What these people have done is to sell government as the solution to the nation's problems. And I think the mere fact that Wilson and Roosevelt carry the day in the election of 1912, that Wilson beats Roosevelt or that Roosevelt might have beaten Wilson is not the issue. That's what everybody focuses on, but that's not the issue. The real issue is together they are basically saying this country has become liberal. This country, this nation has redefined its entire attitude towards the proper role of government in the republic. What progressivism is effectively a second coming of Reconstruction. Remember the liberal Republican reformers during Reconstruction. Those northern anti-slave radicals who wanted to use the power of the federal government to impose a whole new way of life on the South by destroying the way of life that existed there before. And Reconstruction involves the military occupation of the entire South after the war, the Civil War, is over. And the Civil War amendments, as we know, 13, 14, and 15, the movie on Lincoln was about the passage of the 13th Amendment through Congress. And then we have, of course, the very prominent 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. And these are the so-called Civil War amendments. And what we have here in Reconstruction is a redefinition of the role of government from a political structure that ought to be reticent to one that ought to be intrusive, to one that ought to be visible and aggressive. And the idea is, at the time of Reconstruction, we compromised and compromised and compromised with slavery throughout the 19th century. Then we had this war. They left the Union anyway. They became rebels. They engaged in a civil war. That war is over. We won. And that means that it's our prerogative to lay out the terms on which these states can come back into the Union. And the terms we lay out are the terms that we feel we need for the future. And so what we have is a government during Reconstruction who believes that it has the perfect right to impose the kind of government on the recalcitrant South that the states, under the ideas of states' rights, would never do. So the idea is, if something's needed in society and the states won't do it, then the federal government ought to do it. And that's given new life with the progressive era. What the role of the Supreme Court in some of its major decisions has demonstrated in the late 90s, 1890s, is that the challenges of industrialism and the populist movement in America have become so extreme that they are beyond the parameters of state government to fix. Therefore, only federal government can fix them. Therefore, we need a whole new way of looking at what government's proper role is in society. And instead of a Supreme Court that is trying to preserve the past, what we need is an aggressive president and legislature that are willing to enact the kinds of legislation that we need to address a vibrant, unpredictable, and challenging future. And the entire nation buys into that, and the results of the election of 1912 prove it. because the progressive candidates dominate the election. William Howard Taft is slaughtered. He's the candidate of the Republican Party. One of America's two major parties comes in a distant third. What does that tell you? It basically tells us that the whole temper of the nation has changed. And as the emphasis has shifted from municipal to state to national, then we begin to look at the emergence of prominent progressive leaders, spokesmen, and we get to the personages of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. I want to touch just a little bit on, we've only got 15 minutes left in our program today. We can pick up on this tomorrow, but I want to mention today a little bit about Woodrow Wilson, because I think most people, when they look at progressivism, feel that Roosevelt really defines it. So I want to give him due attention. So tomorrow, in tomorrow's program, I want to look at Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech, in which he pretty well lays out what he sees as the proper role for government in this kind of a society. But if you read the thinking and the writings of Woodrow Wilson, who is as progressive as well, he's different than Roosevelt. The two are night and day. Woodrow Wilson is very, very formal. He's a prominent, he comes from a Presbyterian family. His father was a Presbyterian minister. He, besides being governor of the state of New Jersey, I think most important, he was president of Princeton University, one of the most prominent universities in America. It's very obvious to me, and of course Roosevelt comes from the Roosevelts, and like the Rockefellers, that says a lot. That name says a lot. The point that I want to make before going into Wilson a little bit is that, going back to the idea of progressivism as being radical as opposed to liberal, or liberal as opposed to radical. Presidents of Princeton University are not your classic radicals. If you think of radicalism as labor radicalism or communism, socialism, or whatever, radicals don't become presidents of Princeton University. Radicals are not Roosevelts. Roosevelts come from big money. They obviously have a commitment to community, to the nation. But why in heaven's name would they undertake a movement to overturn the political and social and economic structures of the nation when in fact they are sitting at the top of that? Their priority is to preserve a system that they believe in, not undo a system that they don't. And I would suggest to you that if that is the distinction that you use between liberal and radical, then you have to look at the progressive movement as not a radical movement at all. The populist movement is radical. What the progressive leadership did to populism is liberal. And I think it's very, very important that we are aware of those distinctions. If you read the writings and the speeches of Woodrow Wilson, he's a very interesting, a brilliant. He's one of my favorites for a lot of reasons. He's written a tremendous series on government. He believes in the British political system, and he believes that the closer we model the American political system on the British system, the better off we'll be. He's a political scientist. He's a moderate. He's a Christian. He's a very, very positive, prominent Christian. He believes in America. He believes that there are problems that America faces which must be fixed. He believes that government is the entity best able to fix them. If you read his speeches, and I can remember I heard this in a presentation that I went to at Princeton, interestingly enough, about 3 years ago on progressivism. It was a criticism of Wilson and a criticism of progressivism, but it was based on research that I was very, very respectful of. I thought I had heard some things. This fellow had done some research on Wilson that I was unfamiliar with, and I found it very, very enlightening. And one of the things he talked about in Wilson is Wilson's appreciation for the role of government in the world that we find ourselves in at the turn of the century, from the 19th and the 20th century. Wilson goes all the way back to the founders. He's committed to the ideas of the founders and the principles of the founders. He believes in free enterprise. He believes in entrepreneurism. He's a supporter of capitalism. He's not anti-capitalist at all. But he does not believe that the myth of social Darwinism, struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, may the best man win, he doesn't believe that you can function that way. He believes that that philosophy, which is driving the Supreme Court in the late 19th century, as the court is doing everything it can do to disarm government efforts to regulate the economy and manage it. Wilson believes that progressivism is addressing a whole new set of problems. And he believes that America is trying to address a new world with old tools. He believes that in progressivism, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, as a result of technology, as a result of the inflow of immigrants into America and its industrialization, as a result of America's increasing role in the world as leader, not only military but commercial and industrial leader, we are an economic power by the turn of the century. Wilson believes that all of these things, all of these changes, have created the need for a whole new way of looking at the relationship between government and its people. Wilson believes that the state in the modern world must assume, and of course by the state he means government, which is the effective arm of the state. He believes that the state must assume the same role that the founders saw the natural aristocracy assuming. The founders did not believe that everybody was equally or equally capable, and they believed that the whole idea of the republic was to create a system where the greatest talent and the greatest stability would rise to the top. Wilson believes in a similar process. He believes that the state must perform many of the duties and many of the functions that were performed traditionally by the so-called natural aristocracy. He believed that the situation calls for it, that the problems and the challenges identified and outlined by progressives, by the muckrakers, etc., suggest that the nation faces problems that are bigger than any existing entity can address, except government. Government naturally must assume the paternalistic role that aristocrats believed that they had a right to in the colonial and early national period of this nation's history. They believe that government must represent and become actively involved in the definition of the public interest. Government must become the ally of its people. Government must put the priorities of its own people ahead of the priorities of any specific group. Wilson believes that with industrialism and with the emergence of corporate America, the dangers of that are incredible. What he calls his new freedom is the idea that government must undertake the the challenge of breaking up corporations, because Wilson believed that corporations become so big and so powerful that they make it impossible for individuals to or small companies to compete with them. And he believes the whole idea of what makes capitalism go is the competition. And therefore, government must have a vested interest in preserving competition, which he defines as preserving freedom. And that means it must break up corporations. It must break up any organization that becomes so big that it inhibits freedom and competition rather than supports it. But I think, to me, the most telling part of this was his philosophical idea that the state must become the father figure for the people of this nation, because the situation and the challenges have become bigger than the people can be expected to handle by themselves. And therefore, government's job is to preserve the conditions which can allow the individual to prosper. To Wilson, big is bad. When a company becomes too big, it becomes destructive of the very system that had allowed it to get that big. Government's job is to move in and break it up and reinstitute the freedom that goes with it again. He called it the new freedom. And his basic idea is that people must believe they have a chance. They must believe that there's opportunity for them. Therefore, everything in society that inhibits their opportunity, government's responsibility is to move out of the way or get rid of in their interest, and to preserve the system of freedom and competition, and as much as possible to institute the realities of a society where freedom, where equality of opportunity is real. He believed that. And, so in a sense, I have, everybody called Wilson the dreamer and the idealist. He's very idealistic. I happen to be one of those people that believes that idealism is not bad. I think we need a lot of it. I can remember, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so let me just end with a story. When I took American literature in college, I can remember the instructor rationalizing the fact that because we were behind, he was going to skip the Transcendentalists, which was Hawthorne and Emerson and Thoreau, and that whole period, he was going to skip them. And his rationale was, and I'll never forget this, that these Transcendentalists were extreme idealists. They were dreamers. They lived in their own world, not in ours. Therefore, nothing that they contributed or had to contribute had any value to us, because they were operating in a world which was not ours. And this idea that they were so idealistic that they weren't even in our world, therefore that if we have to skip something, we ought to skip that because they really have no relevance for us anyway. I'll never forget that. It was in my sophomore year in college, which was 1966. I'll never forget it. Because there was something about that. I had read a little Emerson. I've read quite a bit more Emerson since then. And I thought, boy, if Emerson's not giving us something worth having, I don't know who is. But that's basically the idea that Wilson is criticized because he's so idealistic. And I think one can be too idealistic, but on the other hand, I'm one of those people that believes that idealism, a little idealism here and there is a good thing. Maybe we better quit. It's 59 minutes after the hour, and I know Bob Kincaid is getting ready to fire up his program on the horn. I want to thank you for listening. We'll be back together again tomorrow. Tomorrow I want to deal specifically with Theodore Roosevelt and his new nationalism, and get into him in some depth, because I think he epitomizes progressivism. I think we'll learn a lot from looking at the writings, at the very, very famous speech of Theodore Roosevelt. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. Thank you for being with us. We hope that we can do this again tomorrow. Please be safe. We want you to come back. Thank you.